Hi, this is Donna with Sparrowstudios7, bringing to you the commentary on Genesis 12, and then I'm going to do a separate video specifically about Abraham, which will count as today's commentary as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I pray that it blesses you as we talk about this, because it's not it's not about me, it's all about God. Alright, so let's get started. This chapter is listed in my Bible as the call of Abram. So here's what it says first about verses 1 through 9. Yes, Beanie. Okay. Through Abram's faith and family, God began restoring the blessing. God called Abram from a pagan world to begin a new nation. His promises to Abram later became a covenant. We see this in chapter 15. We will see this in chapter 15. God's call to Abram later helped convince the Israelites to leave Egypt and go back to the land God promised to Abram. It also reminded the Babylonian exiles their need to return to their land. We see this in Isaiah 51. There you go. Alright, so the first 3 verses are structured around 2 commands to Abram. Leave and be a blessing, which we see in I will make you into a great nation, in verse 2. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. Each directive is followed by 3 promises conditioned upon obedience. So it says, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you. We see that in verse 3. So it says, based on Abram's obedience to the command to be a blessing, God gave him 3 more promises. Those who treat you with contempt, people who disregarded Abram and his covenant were rejecting God's choice and plan. All families on earth will be blessed. By faith, they could participate in the covenant God was making with Abram. The blessing spread to the whole world through Abraham, Israel, the covenants, the prophets, Scripture, and the Messiah. We see this in Galatians 3:8-16, and also in Romans 9:4 through 5. One moment, please. Here we go. Okay. So, beginning of the chapter, God calls Abram to leave his home and head towards the land of Canaan, right? So, the note on 12:4-9, Abram's obedience to God's call corresponded to God's commands. He journeyed to Canaan and became a blessing. Abram was middle-aged, we see in verse 4, settled, prosperous, aristocratic, and polytheistic. We see that note on chapter 11, verses 27 through 32. When the Lord spoke to him, though, in the beginning of chapter 12, he obediently left his old ways in to follow God's plan. Since Abram responded in faith, God's promises could be confirmed in the binding covenant that we'll see in a couple of days when we talk about chapter 15, 8 through 21. So, the Hebrew word for people is Hanapesh, the lives he had taken into his household were probably converts. Abram first became a blessing by influencing people in his household to join him in following the Lord. Okay. So he first went and he stopped at the oak of Moreh. We see this in verses 6 and 7. It was apparently a Canaanite shrine. Fertile groves of trees were sacred to the Canaanites, and Moreh means teacher. We note that it was sacred to the Canaanites in Isaiah 1, chapter 1, verse 29. Abram proclaimed the Lord's name beside a pagan place of worship and instruction, and Luther preached. We see this in Genesis 12:8. Abram continued to be a blessing when he built an altar to worship God at Shechem and east of Bethel. We saw that in verse 8. The Lord appeared to Abram at Shechem. We saw that in verse 6 of this chapter, to confirm that this land was the promised land. Israel was to occupy this land by sharing God's promise required their faith. We saw that in Numbers 14, and we'll see it in Joshua chapter 1, 6 through 9. To your descendants, Abraham did not yet possess the land. He lived as a temporary settler. Okay, so Abram also had to keep moving camp because the Canaanites had the fertile land. He had to move from spot to spot because he was just a settler instead of an actual resident. Then it jumps from 10 to 20 with this whole business in Egypt. And here's what it says. Basically, to give you a quick recap, Abram convinces his wife, Sarai, to say that he is his sister, which is technically also still true. And they actually no, it's not true. So Sarai is his wife, and Abram talks to Pharaoh and the residents of Egypt and tells them that it is his sister instead of his wife. One moment, please. Beanie, I don't know what's going on, but we're talking about Jesus right now. Come here. Come on. His ball fell in front of the window, and he wanted me to save it for him. He's 2 years old. He's still a puppy. Okay, so Abram married Sarai, but when they go to Egypt, he wants Sarai to say that they're siblings, and Pharaoh thinks that she is beautiful and takes her into his house. And then God sends plagues on them because she's a married woman, and so he lets them go. And this note is specifically about why God sends the plagues to Egypt, and how I guess the best way to say this is that God always has a plan to protect us from our own stupidity. It's not that Abram was stupid. He made a bad choice. He made a stupid choice. And in this, God still protects us from poor choices. So here's that note for you. And I am so grateful that God does that. So this episode shows that God would not allow Abram to jeopardize his promises. Just after Abram's obedience to the call, a famine tested his weak faith. God delivered him and his family, even though Abram foolishly used deception rather than trusting in God to preserve him in Egypt. This story deliberately parallels Israel's later bondage in Egypt because of a famine. Abram and Israel both went to Egypt. There was an attempt to kill males and save the females. I'm going to go over this note more in the second video because there's just so much. But essentially, God does not let us ruin his plans. And we can trust in the fact that he always looks out for us. I'll be back in a moment.